John, you want to build on those, what you learned in the DE&I session, analytics?
Sure. So we did a few sessions, Tony Byers and I, on DE&I metrics and analytics. And I kind of bucketed my thoughts into three main areas in terms of what we're seeing companies focus on. So the first area is around maybe more of a classic approach to measuring diversity, and that's around demographic representation. So many companies collecting data on the makeup of their workforce and doing cuts by race, gender, and other demographic characteristics. And I think the new development, which we just heard about with Boeing, and also if you've seen, Verizon also released a human capital report with very detailed demographic data. The new development is the transparency piece of kind of publicly releasing this information, which is something we certainly haven't seen in the past. So that's kind of one main area. And I think for each of these, I'll just highlight a quick challenge too. I think the challenge there around the demographic data piece is that these are sort of lagging indicators, right? It's the product of what you've been doing. And so it's not very forward looking in terms of telling you where you need to focus. I think that brings me to a couple of the other bucket areas. So the second one being around inclusion. And so you've heard a lot about this already today, but just how are we measuring inclusion? What does it mean for us? And then how are we actually collecting the data? So a lot of work around surveys, focus groups, and so forth. The inclusion index idea, whether that's an off-the-shelf measure or creating your own custom index, a lot of work there. I think the challenge that we've heard about is around how you tie that to your strategy and kind of what you're trying to accomplish as an organization. So that does make it difficult to know what to measure and what the right questions are and so forth. So a lot of work going on there. And I think the last area is really interesting to me. It's more around the scientific or analytical approach to DE&I. And it speaks to what Yolanda mentioned around trying to get at some of the causes of what we're seeing. And so a lot of companies are thinking about how do we understand some of the key drivers of where we're at today and what kind of steps can we take to intervene, and then how do we measure and evaluate whether those interventions are effective. And so I think the challenge there has been around the complexity of a project like that, the data required, the resources, and kind of the discipline to be able to execute that over the long term. So those are sort of the three main areas that we heard across the groups.
We had some questions earlier too, John, that I'm going to throw your way and that people are interested in. So can you share some of the ways that companies calculate ROI?
So ROI, we haven't heard a lot of examples of companies doing that. I mean, the classic, think about benefits versus costs, relative to costs, that kind of approach. I think the way companies are approaching it is, like I said, more of this analytical, what are the key drivers here and are we seeing a gain over time? If we make a change to our selection and recruitment processes, are we seeing the downstream impact for a particular group, right? So almost like pilot studies, experimentation, trying to make connections between drivers and outcomes as opposed to just the metrics and tracking, like I said, demographics or inclusion and just measuring that over time. So I think that's been the approach, is more around, seeing if the interventions are having any impact.
Yeah, and I know companies are always interested in specifics, right? What are the metrics that companies are using to track D&I?
So, there are a handful of kind of, like I said, more off the shelf, partners, I'm sure, that many companies work with to be able to benchmark where they're at on inclusion, or surveys that are sort of been standardized. And then, like I said, the more difficult work, but I think maybe more fruitful areas to think about more custom approaches, right? So there's a lot of ways to think about inclusion, and some may make little sense for your specific employee group or your strategy or your context. And so that approach gives you the chance to, like we heard earlier, listen to your employees, think about what inclusion looks like for you, create your own index, and then track that over time. So, it's a recurring question in any of this: how do we measure it? What's the best way? And of course, it's probably different in many contexts. It's a tricky one to answer.
I got a couple more for you, John, before I come to you, Tony. So are companies looking, John, at key talent and ready now successors for areas where they're underrepresented? And what's the best way to forecast your representation trends?
So I think for the first part of that, yes, we did hear, I think DE&I concerns cutting all the way across. across all areas of the talent life cycle, if you will. And the second part, again, I'll see if I can tie that together. Second part of that
What's the best way to forecast your representation trends?
Yeah, I mean, forecasting, the sort of classic workforce planning approach of thinking about transitions. And so we know, whether it's on an annual basis or every 6 months, we can look at historical data and look at the inflows, promotions, exits out, across levels or maybe to other parts of the business, and kind of get an understanding of the flow through. And so you could obviously cut those data by different demographic groups to understand that natural transition pattern. And that, of course, then is the basis for forecasting. Not 100% accurate, but better than nothing, to understand sort of what the flow through is for different groups.
Right. And last question for you for now, John, is, this came up earlier with linking, trying to link metrics to compensation around DE&I. What have you seen there?
Yeah, I've seen both approaches, one of like trying to be very specific about tying metrics to compensation, which is challenging, right? What are the data points and how are you going to actually kind of make that linkage work? We know historically that once you start to measure something and reward for it, it kind of changes the dynamic of the measure in a lot of cases. So that's just kind of a watch out there. And so I think that's what leads to a number of companies not doing that explicitly, but maybe having kind of a softer approach of more of a qualitative assessment of how you've done over the past year relative to what your targets were, your not targets numerical, but just goals for the year were around DE&I. So we've seen that as maybe an alternative to the more quantitative approach of tying comp directly to specific targets.
Okay, yeah, terrific.